Good morning, and welcome to our next in the series of Navigating the Blizzard webinars that we trust are assisting you in really asking the questions and having the conversations that are necessary during this time of crisis. Today I'm going to be in conversation with Farah Esmail. She's our head of Kenya, head of Sidar Kenya, and I'll give her an opportunity in a few minutes to just introduce herself and share how things are going in that part of the world. And so those of you joining us from all over different parts of Africa, we trust that this time is one where we can think through, and today we're going to be talking about thinking through how to protect and manage your most valuable asset, your people. And so today I've kind of informally called the people conversations. And as we go, please remember to engage with us. You can use the Q&A box, the chat box. I'll be monitoring those as we go, and we'll see how many of your questions we can address during this time. Once again, just to position what we're aiming to do during this series of webinars. The idea is we met as this thing started to unfold, and we said, what can we give away? What can we do to help companies going through some really, really critical things to determine the next steps in their business? And so we're positioning these not as people who have all the answers, because as this thing unfolds and emerges, we're seeing things that obviously none of us have ever been through before. But what we can do, having worked in the boardroom for 10, 11, 12 years, is we can help you to ask the right questions. And that's the conversation we want to have today, is going to be around, well, what questions, what topics, what issues should you be dealing with and talking to in your business, especially related to your people? And then obviously thinking through the implications and impact of these steps. Those of you who've been on the webinars, we've touched on stakeholders, we've touched on risk, and I encourage you to go back and listen through those as well. We're trying to be as practical as possible so that you can take the decisions in a responsible but effective way. There are lots of challenges, and you'll see in a few minutes we talk about some of the tensions that we're experiencing through this time. Tensions, what do we need to keep in balance? And then enabling us to position ourselves to see this thing through. These are designed as working webinars, so once again I encourage you to grab a pen and a paper and make some notes and write down, so that by the end of this conversation you've got some things you can do going forward. We also try to keep it as personal as possible, and I thought in terms of today's conversation and the people conversations, I'm actually sitting here with a hat on for a specific purpose. I attended church, and we've obviously gone online, and we had the leader of our church had a message earlier this week, and he was wearing a hat, and he said, well, people have been asking me why I'm wearing this hat, and he told about going to the center of Joburg, to Parktown in Johannesburg, to fetch his son from school. And while he was waiting, he saw a small hat shop open, and he walked in, and the proprietor of the shop was sitting quite devastated and just, obviously overwhelmed by what was going on. And he said, what's going on? And the comments were, well, no one's bought anything. I don't know what I'm going to do. And so he undertook, and he bought a hat, and the hat he bought is the hat he's wearing. And he encouraged all of us. Today, as South Africa enters, so the other person will think South Africa's entering our first day of lockdown. And that's challenging for many of us. And so we're wearing hats in solidarity with all the businesses out there that are thinking through what they need to do to survive and persevere through this time. So with that, I want to hand over to Farah briefly. Farah, good to just get a brief introduction from you, and then a personal account of how this is affecting you, and just remember to unmute.
Great. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So as Roger said, my name's Farah Esmail. I'm head of Kenya for Sidar Group. I'm a lawyer for about 20 years, and 15 of those practicing in senior management roles as head of HR and legal. So HR was a big part of what I did. worked across different businesses, different industries, different sizes, startups to family businesses. And my last role in that capacity was at KK Security, which is a company of Gardaworld with about 10,000 employees in Kenya and 25,000 across the African region. So people issues were huge. I'm now part of the senior leadership at the Sadar Group and involved in making decisions we've had to make in the last week, which have been very difficult decisions around our people and what to do. And so I know that a lot of us, follow Richard Branson and what he said, but he does believe that people are your asset that you need to protect. I mean, one of his very famous quotes is, take care of your employees and they will take care of your business. It's as simple as that. And I do come from that philosophy. So sometimes it is a discussion of philosophy, and we'll be talking a lot about that today. And in terms of how this has affected me, we're really set up for an online business here in Nairobi. So for me, I was already set up to work from home with meetings outside of the house. And so basically I went online. It first started with no handshakes, which in Kenya, we know everyone loves to shake hands, to working from home, taking all meetings online, and really seriously taking this. And actually I found that I was saving more time not traveling around in Nairobi traffic. And but the things that really have taken time are the things that we take for granted, which is the people that I outsource to that make my life easier, who I've also sent home because of the virus. As we know that in Kenya, there is a curfew now, and essential services are the ones that are being asked to go to work. And we do know that most offices are trying to work from home. So it's really forcing people to look at this work from home situation. But we will acknowledge that there are some businesses like manufacturing and the essential services that really can't work from home. And so have had to put into place a lot of different, what would you say, mechanisms in place to handle the situation. So I look forward to conversing with all of you and answering some of your questions.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Farah. And I think what is pertinent is often we think that it's just our scenario and our situation that is being changed, but actually this is something that is engulfing the globe. And so just in starting the conversation and laying a foundation, I want to start with, as I have been in the other webinars, some positioning thoughts. How do we get our thinking right? Because often when we think about businesses, we think about what we have to do, but what we do follows what we decide, and what we decide follows how we think. And so I want to frame a few ideas around thinking, around how we should think through this crisis, think in this time of crisis. And in a sense, as Farah mentioned, some of us, in some senses, in some part of our businesses, have got more time than we had before. And so this time we need to be investing properly. I want to frame the company relationships and where and how this relationship, or what this relationship looks like between the board and management, because that helps us define some of the tools that we actually have to work with. And then on the basis of that, on the back of that, we're going to move into some key questions to address. And I think, as Farah mentioned, is some of the things we want to try to address is the whole scope of business. The reality is some businesses are able, as Sadar has been able to a large degree, shift things online. I'm involved primarily in educating people about directorship and boards. And for me, in a sense, I've moved from talking to rooms of people to talking through my computer to people sitting individually in their own spaces. It's very, very different. I often find it, exhausting. But at the end of the day, for some of us, it is easier than for others, and we need to acknowledge that. And in our businesses, for some of the people in our businesses, it's going to be an easier transition than for others. And so we want to address those. The first foundation for thinking that I've been touching on through these webinars is this concept of what I call liminal thinking. And liminal comes from the Latin word for threshold. And it's also the foundational belief of our approach to this, or what we believe going into this blizzard, or having been engulfed by this blizzard. And a blizzard is an overwhelming set of circumstances, a whole lot of things happening at the same time. Is we believe very strongly that there is a through. And so the through is what we do and who's accountable. And we're going to talk a bit about that in some ideas around that in terms of people. But as we approach and as we're entering into, and as we see the numbers and watch the numbers, we realize and recognize more and more that this is not a short-term in terms of days and weeks. This is going to be months, and possibly even the impact, certainly, of some of the challenges moving into the next few years. And so the going through it is, how do we approach and prepare firstly? And that's the idea of this series, is to think about what can we do to prepare. And then critical to thinking about that is, well, what will things look like on the other side? And so we're going to unpack that in a webinar next week, but really we're going to start raising the issue with our people. What does it look like on the other side? How can we get them to also think through this thing, as opposed to just being overwhelmed? One of the key concepts in a business, as well, as to recognize that there are different roles in a business. And it's important for us to position this, because many of the businesses we work with have got people who carry different roles and responsibilities. And in brief, what this looks like, some of you will know that the picture in brief in a business. There are 3 primary roles in a business. At the top there, we have the shareholding role. At the middle, we have the board role. And in the business, we have the operations or management role. And what we're talking to primarily is to say, well, it's this relationship here, where decision makers on the board are having to make decisions around their people. And the decision making at board level is around governance. And the key thing to recognize is that the relationship between the board and operations, or the board and management, is essentially a policy framework. And so what does a policy framework encompass? We call it the 4 flows. And what that means is that the accountability for the decision always moves up. So accountability in our policy framework always moves up. The 2 things that a board has to give away through operations, and obviously it's not just to the CEO, but to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. And so one of the key things in people is to understand that the people in our business are constrained or guided and enabled by the policy framework that they operate within. And so one of the challenges at this time is to think through what our framework is. And so what a policy framework has to give away, it has to give away authority, and it has to give away responsibility. And so accountability always moves up, authority and responsibility move down. And we have to ask the question, how does that change in this time? And then critical during this time is to say, how do we keep in touch? How do we get evidence? How do we performance manage people? All of those questions are people questions. And so the word that I use for the flow that moves back up is disclosure. And so the accountability moves up, authority and responsibility together have to move down. And then disclosure is the information that we get. Today it's becoming and going to be quite challenging. We have to think about, how do we actually ensure that we get the right information from people flowing back up in the organization? So framing it, we're talking essentially about these 2 roles, the decision-making role at the board level, and then the doing role at management or ops level, and the critical link. And so this does start with thinking as boards. And as I've said to a number of people in the last 2 or 3 weeks, if your board hasn't met, it's almost too late. Because these things have to start with board level discussions. Another framing concept is performance, and understanding performance and thinking about, where does performance come from? And I have used this in a couple of other webinars, but it's critical to understand that when we talk about performance in a business, performance in our business comes from the combination of our systems and our people. And so some of what we're going to focus on, and what we've said in the previous slide, is that it's the systems within which our people work, so that there is a relationship between this, but we need to think about, what is it going to take to perform over the next period of time, be that a few months or into the next couple of years, and do we need to revisit what we're doing in our systems, and then also how do we keep our people engaged? And so critical to that is also to say that performance happens in the space between where we want to be in the future, all right, and where we are in the present, all right. And in the present, I've drawn what I call a business model, and a business model is where our people are, it's where the things we do are, it's where we manage our assets, and it's where we partner with those other parties in the environment. And so we're talking about, performance happens in this space here. It happens between where we are now and where we want to be. And that means, that positions everything we're doing from a strategic point of view. And I want to keep reminding us as we go through this webinar that we're talking about, these are strategic conversations. We need to understand that as directors, the role of the director is to be accountable for the best interest of the business while taking into account the impact on all the stakeholders. And our employees are critical stakeholders in our business. And so we've got to think through, what does the business look like in the future, and where are our people in the center of that, in a sense. And so with that in mind, I also want to just, if we look at what we're talking about, and the practicality is we want to try to answer the question as we go. And this is why, we want to be thinking about and answer your questions. So please put your questions up in either the chat box or the Q&A. And then what should we do? So where do we start and what should we do? So we want to try to answer that question. And I love Kathy. Thank you for sharing on the chat box. She says she's wearing locally made shoes this week. There are lots of stories we can tell. I went to Friday night in our home. We normally get takeaways. So last Friday, I went out to a store close by, and the proprietor of the store was sitting there, and he was saying, his people were very quiet. And I think he decided to spend the time at the business for the evenings because he wanted to encourage his people. So there's lots of personal stories, but perhaps also to position it is to say, well, as only Winston Churchill could have said, is we must never waste a good crisis. So as we ask the questions and as we think about the crisis we're going through, let's be as practical as possible. And so some of the things we want to talk about, there's obviously this whole topic of remote work. There are other challenging topics or technicalities, and that's at that stage I'm going to definitely ask Farah to share some of the things she's been encountering. And then it's important for us to revisit how we do things in certain areas. And then we want to cover some principles for moving forward. And so first place to start, and maybe to bring you in again, Farah, on this is, I think at this stage in business, we are been talking about people. We are really thinking about what are the tensions or balances or things we need to balance. And my first thoughts around that is there's obviously the people and the money, and there's obviously the performance of the company and our individual wellness. And we've got to keep those in tensional balance. And then we've got to pay attention to the individual and also pay attention to the team. Your thoughts on that as kind of founding or positioning?
Yeah, so that is the first tension is what we're seeing with a lot of people being laid off at this point. I think what you mentioned before, this tension between systems and people, that's what we're going to get right. And even right now, you're seeing a lot of people moving to an online model. A lot of grocery stores that I've gone to in person that are small grocery stores, putting in the systems in place, but you still need people. So people are an essential part. So in trying to make cuts at this time, there has to be sensitivity around really, you might need these people down the road. So trying to maintain the knowledge in the company and doing the best you can to keep your people on, of course, within reason. That your company can maintain the people on the payroll, look at creative ways to keep your people on, which would be the same thing in a redundancy argument. You're going to see where else can you place them? Is there something else you can do? Can you move them across different companies? What do you do? You're going to have those same conversations to try and keep your people on. But it does give you a really good time now to reorganize if you have done that around your organogram.
Yeah,
with the company performance and individual wellness, again, that's the whole thing. Like, your people are who you need to take care of, and we've had a lot of discussions around this. And I think in at least my experience in Kenya, and I've worked in North America as well, we come from a very much of a micromanaging mindset. It's a culture. You want people in seats, you want them in front of you. And I think at this time we have to change that and trust our people and give them the opportunity to step up. I mean, there is a discipline around the work and workplace, but you almost have to give them an opportunity to step up and realize that you're working together for the balance of wellness. I think if you're going to have, if you can manage to move your company and your people to work from home, and again, we did say that there's some companies that cannot, But this whole crisis is actually forcing companies to do what they should have probably had done before, which is look at work from home policies. So a lot of companies internationally that I would probably say are progressive companies have for many years had work from home policies and a trust principle and the proper reporting lines and accountability, because that's what the concern is. Are these people going to flake off and just go to sleep at home and not perform? So you have to build around that. And we'll talk a bit more about that on the whole work from home side. But you need to be able to balance those things, because at this time you're looking at the wellness of your employee. You're looking at, you could be liable if you're exposing them to the coronavirus and you have other options and you're forcing them.
And we'll certainly touch on, we'll certainly pick up on those things, you know, in a few slides, some of the technicalities. But I think also just, so my thought around the wellness, which I think is important to remember, is that people, this isn't just a business issue. This is a personal issue. It's a private issue. You know, the danger is we have people walking around who may not have disclosed an underlying health issue that they've picked up by going to the doctor, and their anxiety levels may just be, you know, through sky high, whereas other people are taking it quite, you know, and so it's being aware of some of those. Thoughts? And so some of those as well, I think, is the key thing. And we put at the bottom there is to say, if there is not a company at the end of this, there will be nothing we can do for our people. So it's in stark. You know, this is one of those situations, and I often talk about in business that there are crossroads and T-junctions. And in a sense, this is not a crossroad. In other words, people are referring more and more to the new normal going forward. This is a T-junction. We either go one way and we don't get it right and we lose a lot of things. But if we go the other way and think through these things, take advantage of this good crisis. And then obviously if we lose all our people by just looking after the company, we'll not have a company at the end of this. You know, a company is its people. Any other thoughts on those concepts, Farah, before we talk about the more specifics?
I did want to mention to you, and this is why the board is important. Like, these are long-term. What you do now is going to impact where you are. So as I said, and from your quote, this is an opportunity to revisit what you're doing, look at your systems and processes. And that stuff happens at the board level. So this is not something that your senior manager is making a decision on. Like, you do have to have your proper leadership team managing this, because you may not have a company at the end of this if you haven't made the right balanced decisions on this whole situation. But it also sets a new reality. Like, so once you've put people at home now and you've created these policies, you know, what's to say you can't continue that way? So it has to be something sustainable when we come out of this as well. And that's kind of where I talk about it is, and in HR, we look at the role, not the people. So when you create a role,
that's good.
You want to look at, is this role one that can be done from home or not? And you can put that in the job description. And now if the person isn't doing it, then you performance manage the person out. So in HR, you make that clear distinction between a role and a person. And this allows you to clean up your org structure and the roles, and can the role be done from home or not? And which are essential roles in a situation like this, so that right now, companies like KK have had to make a decision on which are essential. Well, the security officers are essential, they have to be out, but also from a management, who needs to be in the office, who needs to be out. So those policies, had these companies been proactive, and, you know, we'd learned from SARS or something, they would already be on the front line having had these policies. So we've had to run around as companies, and at this point come up with these policies under the pressure of the crisis.
Farah, in our previous, I mean, in one of our conversations, you know, we've said that, you know, obviously in Kenya, you've had some micro opportunities through the likes of the terrorist attacks to think through some of this working from home. And so let's on that working from home, you know, it's as you said, role in person, but any specifics around that? What kind of tools have you found helpful, or thinking have you found helpful in that space?
So again, I think part of it is you got to know your team. You got to rely on your managers, and which is how your accountability flows down in a business. So working from home, you need to make sure your people are set up. So do they have internet? Like, do they have the ability? Is the company going to bear the cost? Who bears the cost? But if you're getting savings from a person not having to commute, and there's savings there, you could do a net cost, which is something that we've looked at. So there is, like, will they have the tools they need, which is an employer, you need to provide your employee with the tools. As a consultant, you don't need to provide your consultant with the tools. So that isn't a distinction there. And then really setting up the policies. So again, there's this trust approach and a flexibility approach, which in this time we know we're going through everyone's under stress. And like I said, I have to at somewhere in the day do my dishes and do other things. My days are actually much longer right now because I'm fitting in things that I wasn't usually doing. But I do them around the breaks that I have. So it's up to the company. If you want to do, like, everyone has to check in at 9 and you have to check out at 5. At minimum, as we've done when we've had other issues. So when we had the terror attack in Nairobi, the decision of, do people work from home? Do they come in? Where are we going? How do we check in that everyone's safe? At minimum, getting everyone on a WhatsApp to send in that they're okay and safe would be minimum requirements when people are at home. Whether you have them on video conferencing or not. So again, these are all things you need to discuss, and how much micromanaging and control, how much can you trust your people? How much in the situation are you actually going to just let them step up and test the theory of, can you trust your people? Because I think, like I said, it's cultural. And if you're coming from that culture that you need to constantly watch your people, this might be a good time to let them step up and see what's going on. If they are taking local transit to come in, for instance. So for working from home, if there's a team that's both home and in the office, you need to make special provisions as well. The people having to come in might feel, maybe they're not as important as the people who can work from home and have the safety of their home. Yeah. So I don't know, Roger, how much you want me to talk about?
Yeah. So
cannot work from home.
Yeah. No, I think so. I've just got a question, which is exactly this issue, and it bridges into the, people who cannot work from home. Mahesh, thanks for the question. He says, we've gone down to a skeleton staff, but still worried about their well-being and have not fully set up to make ops online. My business is mostly service industry, so we need to have staff present. Not sure what we're doing in the future. And as you mentioned, you've had a few conversations with some companies that are trying to balance this. So talking about the people who cannot work from home, what are your thoughts and some ideas that people are exploring on that, Farah?
Yeah. So we already know the basics, right? Get them the masks, get them the gloves, get them the sanitizers. Try and keep them distant. I mean, if they're taking public transit. So what KK's done, which I had a conversation with them, because they've got 10,000 security officers, and security is an essential service. So they cannot eliminate that. And they've got a skeleton management team in the office. So a few things that, they've done is they've got a team put together around this whole crisis. There's a team that's managing this, and they're really checking in at 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. with everyone, including all of the security officers. They have provided sanitizers to everyone, gloves and masks to the people in the field. For those coming in, they've separated the space in the offices. They also have a crisis situation where, should someone come in and they actually have the COVID virus, what to do and how to remove them from the premises and get them attention. Okay. There's a COVID phone line as well for anyone to call in if there's issues around this, questions, concerns. So it's a dedicated reporting line for symptoms. And so there's a lot of things they're doing around this to just make sure that the people coming into the office have what they need. Now, the security officers out in the field, again, it's an essential service. They're trying to do the best they can to educate these individuals, where they have been vulnerable employees. So there might be some in the manufacturing companies that we have, people with high blood pressure, HIV, or pregnant. They've actually removed them from work, not as unpaid leave, as sick leave, but they're actually having them just work. They can't work in security office, but basically stay home. So they're removing the at-risk individuals. Now they do know them. Another issue I think we'll talk about a bit later is privacy. So you can't go around, so basically they have a clinic. So as a security company with over 50 employees, they have a clinic in-house where the security officers go when they first are ill. So they have a coding system in that clinic. So they're not saying someone has COVID and freak everyone else out, but they've got a numbering system. So these are some of the things they're doing. And again, you also have to work with what's going on in your business and what best you can do to try and limit this. So I hope those are some good examples.
Those are very, very valuable. And I think, I think it does speak to, we were going to talk about it a little bit later, but you mentioned, because obviously one of the things that businesses have to do is really think through and apply consistently the approach to when someone gets the virus, whether there's someone who's got the virus at home, and what do you do and how do you support them, versus when someone, as you mentioned, a lot of, especially the essential services, retail stores, It may not even be a case of, well, people have, we have a choice, but in some sectors, businesses are going to have to keep operating. Healthcare workers, I'm very, very aware of what those are. So one of the key things there is whatever you do, and I think it's part of this conversation, is to say, think it through and apply it consistently. The worst thing you can do in your business now is to have a different set of rules. And one of the challenges is that it looks like, from what's emerging, that we're not the virus thing. We're not really sure how it behaves into the future. Any other specifics on what companies have thought through or can think through when someone actually gets the virus?
Well, I think you've got to have you've got to have a system in place. And this is, I think, where having an actual HR person in companies. So I've worked with many size companies, and in the smaller businesses, you actually don't have an HR person. Like, so who's really responsible? You might not have a dedicated phone line. Like, who do you talk to? Who does someone go, someone's sneezing next to me, I suspect someone. So I think you need to have who's responsible in the business for this issue, like who is the go-to for people on the ground. You do have a system of removing them, right? Like, you want to remove them from the business, and how do you go about doing that with the privacy issues we've talked about? Yeah. And you also want to have policies in place of, is this something the company will work with? What if they pass away? Like, is this something that the company will pay for their family members? Is there a policy that you already have on employees passing? Generally, it doesn't have to be in the course of business, but then is this in the course of business? So this is interesting. I mean, I don't know if this issue is being tested yet with the insurance companies and whether they would actually cover this. So in Kenya, under the workplace safety, or if this is something that is in the course of employment, then the company is liable. But how can you say it's in the course of employment? And I mean, I don't know if this is an exclusion. So this is something that needs to be checked with each insurance company. It has to be tested as well. So if, for instance, medical workers, I mean, they're there day in, day out. I mean, I think there's a higher likelihood that they caught it in the hospital and in the course of business. Security officers, I don't know. I mean, they could have caught it when they go home. And so there's actually some clients that I was told that KK wants their clients to actually stay on the premises, right? So that they don't contract the illness and then bring it to the place of work. Yeah. So these are all really interesting issues. You do need to look at that policy. And as you said, Roger, I think applying it consistently. You cannot give someone some benefits and not give it to the other. I mean, that's the essential of HR, is having policies that you apply equally across your employees. It could be different by grades of management and levels, but across that grade, you apply it equally.
Yeah. And that's starting to talk to some of the other thoughts we had, is that obviously it's the HR support wellness of staff. And that's why I echo what Farah said. The challenge with many companies, and I've seen it, is often HR, formal HR, is something that it doesn't come first in businesses. It comes second, third, or fourth, possibly. And so we need to be thinking in our businesses is, who is that point person? Who's going to carry that? And it could be that you have an independent director. It could be that you have someone who is just has that. I'll mention one of the other slides later. I talk about the people champion in the business. It was, who's going to look after the wellness of staff? Who's going to do things like ensure that people's privacy is protected? This is a really challenging issue. And in a sense, there's been, there's some precedent with the HIV thing, because that's been a critical thing that is tested to some degree, to a large degree, the data protection and how we deal with people. And then also, and going back to you, Farah, the contractual arrangements being tested, you mentioned that you'd heard a case, as you mentioned, that with the security industry, where guards are saying, well, I mean, can I be put there? Can I not be put there? We're seeing it with the deployment of police and, as you said, medical services. Some of our businesses may not be in that place, but it could lead to some interesting conversations we have to have with our people around their contracts. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So, I mean, the HR support, I've worked in companies where there's actually an HR wellness person, and that's their job. I mean, they make sure the mental health, everyone's fine, they do the checks. We may not have that luxury in every company, or as companies may not even have an HR person, but having a person that kind of checks in with staff at this time, understands their issues, sees how we can support, will really help employees feel like they're being taken care of. And again, going back to my earlier quote, if employees feel like they're being taken care of, they're going to step up and really, I would say, come and work. Be
trustworthy.
Make sure, and be trustworthy. So you can trust them to work from home because they feel that you are taking care of them, you care about them. The data protection, Kenya just enacted its new data privacy, the Privacy Act that came in. So this is all very new, and, you know, just running around screaming that someone has, you know, COVID, or just in sending around data of these are all the people with COVID. I mean, that is a breach of privacy. So within all of this, we have to be really, really concerned about not breaching these restrictions that we have that are legal. The contractual one's very interesting. I mean, we're seeing it in the commercial contract side, where this force majeure clause that kind of is something that lawyers always throw in, and people always wonder why there are these 5 million clauses at the end of a contract, but this is becoming really interesting at this time.
Absolutely.
Really the impossibility of because a contract is a contract between two parties, and the one party saying it is impossible for me to service my end of the bargain because of these God-foreseen issues that have come in, and hence I'm calling a force majeure. So the question is, and my sister works in, she's a doctor working in Florida, and they've run out of PPE. They don't have the proper equipment. And I said, well, actually legally, because I'm her sister and a lawyer, you need to raise the issue that you cannot perform your job without the proper PPE. You're going to put yourself at risk by going to the hospital and not having the right equipment. So you need to raise that issue. Likewise, I don't know if it's been tested here, but there's the side where, you know, an officer could come, a security guard could come and say, you're not giving me the right PPE, or it's impossible for me to actually go to my job because X, Y, Z.
Yes. It's
not been tested, but I think we need to be aware of this, that we are putting people at risk in a time when it might be impossible to do their work. And then it might bring into play what is an essential service, and can those even be performed in this current situation?
Absolutely.
So there are some interesting things that we might see coming out in the market on these things.
Yeah, that the whole concept of force majeure, you know, it's one of those clauses in every contract that it's kind of the cut and paste one. It's the, what do they call it, boilerplate clauses. And I think for the first time ever, people are reading those things and saying, well, firstly, how do we pronounce this strangely spelt word? So at least we've got some insight from you there, Farah. But it's a challenge. It's really, really important to understand what is in our contractual arrangements with people. And especially what is determined or imposed from the outside. As you mentioned, in South Africa, we've also got data protection. We've also got privacy legislation. There's a new wave of that going around the world. And some of you would have companies that operate in multiple jurisdictions. And so even the labor relations in each of those jurisdictions could be challenging and different across the board. And so we have to really know a lot more. Probably we need to be, you know, the reading when I have the time for, we should probably start with some of our contracts so that we can take the right steps to take to save jobs. You know, it is the paradox of people and money. It's also possibly another one to speak to, Farah, is the leave and the flexibility of leave. How are people, or how are companies addressing this thing where some people are having to go away, some people are getting sick? How does one manage or think about the leave policies in this time?
Yeah, and I think that goes again to the legal policies first in the country, so what the Employment Act says, and then it goes down to what your policies say. So again, this is a time you need to be following your policies and doing what your policies say they are. So, you know, traditionally you have sick leave, and so I said some people will say people need to take sick leave if they're sick, some won't. So as I gave you the example, you got to look at, so the leave is set out in the law and also in your handbook. So it could include sick leave, and then you go to, you know, you will have certain amount of vacation that you will then have your people take, and then you could go to unpaid leave. In some companies, there's a limitation to unpaid leave. So if your policy says you can only take 10 days of unpaid leave, what happens after that? So you might have to go back to your policies. There might need to be a revisit at this time. So again, this gives you a chance, if you made your HR policy like 10 years ago and some consultant did it, to go back and actually look at it and what does it say, because you're going to need to know what it says within the context of the law. So the law sets the basic, the Employment Act, but you can actually provide more, and the unions can actually change that requirement as well. So as an example, the number of days given in a collective bargaining agreement will be much higher than what's stated in the Employment Act. So these are all things that you have to take into account.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's another good question here. Thanks again, Mahesh. He says the US is currently seeing 3 million people unemployed. And I saw the stat yesterday. I mean, significant. And just to put that in context, it went up tenfold in 1 week. And so the question is, to what extent do we, or how much should we rely on government? I think my response to that is firstly, understand what the government is offering. So I know that, and I've had exposure to the various regions we work in, and government is stepping forward in different ways. And obviously what we're seeing in some places funds being set up to support business, and we need to understand what the parameters of those are. Sometimes we're seeing, and I know that in Kenya, you're starting to see things like tax concessions for certain categories of workers. But really, I think, Mahesh, can't really answer that at this stage, except understand what government is offering so that we can apply those principles, and especially where they're related to our people. I do believe government is going to do quite a lot for vulnerable people, especially the approach we've seen throughout Africa. There's almost the attitude, and again, almost my interpretation, almost the attitude that people who can look after themselves during this time must look after themselves. But a government's role, I think, is going to come in more for those people who can't do anything. But just to move on as well and talk through, well, what does that mean in terms of some of the key activities we can do? So as businesses, I want to kind of close off the last 10, 15 minutes or so, and I'm starting to see the questions come through. So we'll be addressing some of those. But answering the questions, what should we be thinking about? What should we be applying to our decision making? And a couple of these are really continuing to remain connected. I think one of the things we need to ensure is that we find ways to remain connected, even if it is just with the people who work for us in our homes. The reality is many of us are employers, not just in the business context, but in the personal context. But make sure we connect. Assign managers the task of regular check-ins. I know what we're trying to do with a team that has gone remote, and some people who have never done that before. We're saying at least have a daily check-in, catch the issues early. So be transparent in a sense, put at the bottom there, be wisely transparent. We'll give some insight into some thoughts around that as well. But catch the issues early, allocate accountability. So who are the people in the business? How are we stepping up to the performance management of our people, to the wellness of our people, and then think through our systems and processes. And a thought there in terms of especially the remote work is Inc. magazine, and there was an article I was just researching for them, reading for this webinar, looking at remote work. And Inc. magazine has an interesting comment. Often what happens is we blame the people we put out there and say, well, go and work from home. And then those policies fail, and then we want to bring everybody back in. Farah, as you mentioned, the micromanagement approach. When remote work policies fail, it means employees' goals and expectations aren't clearly defined. And that's on managers. And one of the challenges in this time, and talking about strategic people management or strategic people governance, is to ask the question, how well have we defined the objectives and the goals and the expectations? And are we spending our time just trying to, be worried about, as you mentioned, are people goofing off at home, or are they just not doing anything? I think you mentioned sleeping on the couch, or are we working on ensuring that our people are being trusted with the results that we're expecting them to deliver? And we manage on results as opposed to manage on presence, because presence is no longer that easy. So we need to think about managing on results. Any thoughts around that, Farah, as we go into kind of really thinking about practically what are some of the things we need to be revisiting as well? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so again, this, like I said, is something that you need to set policies around, depending on if you've done this before, if you haven't. So some of the things are, like we said, check-ins. The other things are expected turnaround time. So as I sit here, and I've worked virtually for a long time in my career, and as I sit here, my expectation hasn't changed of my team in the other countries. I expect them to the response to come as quickly as I'd always expected. But for some people, when they move into an out of office space, I guess they almost feel like, well, I'm far away, and the communication has to come in much later. So I think the expectations around turnaround time on responsiveness, what you're supposed to give back to the business, what your tasks are, what your results are. I think that focus, if you come in from that focus, that's much better. And at minimum, the once a day check-in, you could do 2 a day. Of my view, is if you start mandating in a time of this crisis when people are already stressed and go too hard down on a lot of policies, that might actually not be well received.
Yeah.
But you do have to work with your team, the seniority of the team, and where they are. So again, this is a decision that's kind of an individual company decision, but you have to think through this to what level you're going to be trusting your employees from home and what specific additional policies you need in place to manage them.
Yeah, and even if those policies are for the short term. So I do think that there is an opportunity to say this is what we're doing for the next month, 2 months, with a view and positioning it properly, obviously within the relationship. And that's why involvement, and it must start at the board, must provide leadership. The board must be, seen to be engaged. A couple of other questions that have popped up, and I think one of the is interesting. Thanks, Kathy. The concept of the challenge right now with so many people working at home, and I know a lot of people are using this platform, we're using Zoom, is also how do you manage people when internet connectivity, we use these terms, online is easy in today's world. Well, it's not always. And so we have to think about how do we manage decision-making and authority in that space. Take that into account. Here where I'm in South Africa, we have the spectre of something called load shedding, which, could be every couple of days, one has 2 to 4 hours without power. What do we invest in our staff to make sure that they can keep working, make sure that they have laptops with batteries in, or whatever it is? How do we connect with people? So thinking about that as well. I think I see a question, and Farah, maybe this is going back to the leave thing, but the question is, can a company ask staff members to use 1 week of leaves time for the 21 days? So maybe that's not that clear, but just reiterate possibly a flow of thinking in terms of leave. And we touched on this and said maybe it's a case of saying, and again, applying this to whether someone's sick or not. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, the leave again comes from your policy.
Yeah.
So really, if you so a lot of companies, for instance, will close in December, and they'll say in their policy, when we close in December, that 1 week is your annual leave. You're taking that 1 week as an annual leave. The act reads in a way that it says you have to take all the leave or a certain number of days that you can together. In practice, there's some sectors like security sectors, the security officers take the 21 days all together. In practice, we have carved out 1 week out of the 21 days. So again, I think this is also a time where employees are seeing what's going on around the world. And so it would not be unreasonable to actually say, look, would you be able to take your leave? But I think you have to have a policy like that that's come in and again, with engagement. So when you are changing HR policies, you also need to have, you go through a process of consultation. I mean, there's not much time here for consultation, but every time you put together a new handbook, you do need to get some consultation around it and see that it's working for the employees. So it is something that you need to change in your policy if it's not there. But in my view, you could do that. And this is a time of emergency where, to save jobs, you go down that escalation of you take some annual leave. If you have some leave, you go into unpaid leave. If you need to go that way to save jobs.
Yeah. And I think, related to that, obviously it's every context is different. And I think it's important to explore, and it's good to ask the right questions. So I think I would be saying to you that, think about what are the policies. You've also mentioned there that some people can't work from home. The type of work they do is not doable from home, and then one has to have a rational discussion with those. Mahesh has also question around saying, I have had a chat with my staff regards to taking a percentage cut on their salaries once leave allowances are used up. So we keep them employed, but since that we aren't at full force, we need to look after them. And I think those are things that we really should be thinking of. There's a fascinating example of a company, and it's the opposite, where instead of cutting, a company in the States decided to give everybody an increase to a certain level, and people said, "You're crazy. People won't, they won't do the work right." And it's actually worked out well. On the flip side, there was a company that had to make cuts a few years ago, and they went to everybody and said, well, actually, and I know that the situation is not identical, but they said everybody has to work less time. And so the idea was a blanket, 4 days, 3 or 4 days working time a week. And so what would happen is that people who could afford to take more of a cut took the cut and allowed other people to do the work, so we get paid more. So the rules for what we're going through haven't been written. And I think often our legislation hasn't been written with this in mind. So the last few minutes I want to spend, so key things, and we've touched on it, is, really think about the board involvement must involve leadership, thinking through the time management, expectations on people, managing them, thinking about our organograms. Do we need to put things in place for the short term? Who makes the decisions? What is the communication channels? And then checking in. Some thoughts and then principles, I suppose. So in our listening and in our own conversations in Sudar, we've kind of said, well, what are some principles for acting? What are some underlying things we need to think about? And I think it starts with being sensitive to the entire situation that is unfolding. It's the whole, it's something unprecedented. And I know that word is getting a bit tired, but people are being faced with far more than ever before. That's why we're calling this a blizzard. There's so much happening at the same time. Critical is to act consistently with your values, to really examine, and this is an opportunity for your organizational values to step up in a sense. And also expect everyone in the business to do the same. Often what happens is the pressure is on leadership to say act in consistency with the values, and yet we have values about looking after our people, and that's pushed, and that's absolutely essential. But we've probably balanced that with some values about effectiveness, efficiency, being responsible, being accountable, all of those kind of things. And so we have to work together. We're going to get through this together with our people if we work together with our people. And then do understand that there are trade-offs needed, and be clear in what these are. And that's where the wise transparency comes in. As leaders, we need to recognize the trade-offs, recognize what we are, because this is not, we're not, as I said, in a crossroads situation where we can just carry on. We are being forced to shut down. There is a lot of stuff being imposed about us. And so in thinking through those, we need to think through the decisions needed. What will doing this mean when things get back to the new normal? So what do things look like? What could things look like in 6, 12, 18 months time? What are our objectives and goals? And how do we manage people and align people in terms of our values? So the depth of our values and the strength of our forward vision is going to carry us through this. And then be very quick to address misunderstandings and confusion. We found what's been useful in our team, and we're not a huge team, we've called quick meetings to say, let's get everybody on the same page, because everybody's trying their hardest to do well and to keep everybody going through this. But we need to also keep on the same page. And that's why allocating decision-making, holding people accountable, and the word that Farah's used a number of times is trusting our people. We employed them because we believed they were the best people for the position. Let's trust them to be that going forward, and let's expect them to be trustworthy. That's why I said expecting everybody in the business to do the same. And another key thing, and then I'll ask you to reflect after this, Farah, is information and communication. Communicate often and well. Often, in business, we're almost scared to communicate unless it's all perfect. Communication in this time is not about perfection, it's about effectiveness of the communication. I've found in our team meetings, people listen and ask more, because in the past we could let misunderstandings possibly roll. We can't in this situation. We need to be very clear about what are we saying about different things. We've also found it important to set in place communication guidelines and sharing guidelines. As you probably have, we have a number of groups and WhatsApp groups. We use technology to keep people connected. We've had to make some decisions about what we do and what we don't share on some of those platforms, because people are in different situations. There are some people, their life is relatively unchanged. As Farah mentioned, she's in effect not changed that much because she's worked from home. I've worked from home in the past. My main change is I don't travel as much, but be sensitive that everybody is going through their own journey. And then also recommend sources of information for your people to follow. People are going to want to look for information, but find credible sources of information and warn against fake news and reactionism. as I mentioned, seek out people champions through this. There are going to need to be less formal channels that people can engage through. And as leaders, we need to stay updated in what's going on. So in the last few minutes, if there are still a couple of questions you have, please feel free. But just thinking about those couple of slides, Farah, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned communication at this time is the most important thing. We're in a stage of uncertainty. There's a lot of panic and stress with the employees. So communicate well, communicate often, let people know what's going on, what's the next stage, because that's what's going to get you out of this. One of the things that, is if you have unions, I don't know if they're communicating with you or not, but that's another thing. I mean, you got to keep your different stakeholders and your people are definitely one of the stakeholders, but any other stakeholders related to your people, make sure you're communicating with them. It's just in this region, we don't have that social net. We've talked about and I know in Canada and in the US, people are filing unemployment claims. We don't have that option here. So our social net and our economy here is a lot more fragile. So I think as much as we can here in this region, understanding that there isn't that buffer for our people, and trying to do the best we can to make sure that we do save some jobs through being creative, realigning, reallocating. And I think if we communicating that, we will get on the other end people meeting us. So like Mahesh has mentioned, cutting down the salary by 75%. But if that saves jobs, I think people will be open to stepping up and meeting that kind of action. So I think it's part of it is just being sensitive because we don't have that ability here. And yes, the government is doing what it can, but I think this is just huge. So the people issues are huge. Thinking through this is really important. And when we come out of this, because we need to make sure we have a business with people that will be working in the business. So that's part of it. So trying to save as much of that knowledge as we can. It's also a time to understand, have we been retaining our knowledge and documents and all of that? Because with people leaving, we lose our company knowledge. So again, that's another factor that you have to bring in, because a lot of companies, that's an area that there's a failure on, is actually retaining company knowledge. And in a time like this, we go through a whole phase of terminations and we lose half of our business IP and knowledge that just walked out the door. So we need to think about that.
Yeah. And I do think, going back to what Winston Churchill, as only Winston Churchill could say, is, we don't want to miss the opportunity to reimagine and rethink during this crisis. We need to reimagine and rethink our organogram, either for the short term or for the long term, and probably for both. We need to think through performance issues. What are we capable of at this time? What are the capacity issues in the business? And then relying or really digging deep in terms of our culture and allowing our culture and our values to carry us through. And then thinking about our strategy and business model. And that's a topic we're going to pick up on at the next webinar, is to really think about, well, what should this look like? How do we think through this going forward? And with that in mind, it is time, unfortunately, these conversations could go on. And I think we are loving the fact that we're getting lots of engagement and we're seeing a lot. And so what we're doing, one of the things we're going to be doing going forward is we're packaging some of what we're covering in these webinars into a half-day online workshop. It's essentially around decision-making in crisis. We're going to be taking some of the topics we're covering here, as I said, digging a bit deeper into them, as well as providing practical cases or examples, and then tools and templates. Again, trying to keep it as conversational as possible, as engaging as possible, because we need to be, we're in the midst of this crisis. And so if you can, you'll be getting some information around that. Thanks for registering on the webinar. As a result, we'll be getting you information. Those will be, starting in the short term. So if that is of interest to you, you'll see all the details come out. Please register for those and express your interest in those, and we'll hopefully help you in that as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us online. There will be a survey that comes up after the webinar is closed, and please continue to engage with us. Our doors are open. We've taken the decision, obviously, that we're not shutting down. We're obviously managing. We're going through the same thing. So these conversations, and thank you, Farah, for your insights, for your input. I'm sure that if we'd had 2 or 3 hours, there would have been even more to share. Any last thoughts from you?
Really, I think companies have to keep in mind that you're here and you do have an impact on the environment, the community, the people, and everyone else. So I think this is more so than in any other time, this will be tested in the decisions we make as companies. So yeah, thank you everyone for your time and for listening in. And we look forward to engaging with you in future webinars as well and our
Absolutely.
other services.
Good. Thanks so much, Farah. Have a wonderful Friday, everybody. I know that that's critical. Take some time out this weekend to process and to think through your own wellness and your own well-being. I saw a quote the other day that said, because we can't go outside, that doesn't mean we can't go inside. And what that meant was, you know, how do we go deep in terms of our own thinking? Marina, can we connect? And afterwards, I need to finalize the webinar. And so with that in mind, I'm going to be signing off, and have a wonderful, wonderful Friday. Thanks so much. Bye.